This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. In this episode of the podcast, I'm chatting with home gardener and author Bailey van Tassel about the art of kitchen gardening. We explore Bailey's seasonal intuitive approach to growing food at home and discuss insights from her book, Kitchen Garden Living. With a focus on simplicity and sustainability, Bailey shares her thoughts on cultivating a thriving kitchen garden.
I was raised on a little hobby farm in Northern California here in America. And we had like chickens, and I had a sheep living in the house with us at one point, horses, mules. We had a small garden, but I had no interest whatsoever in that lifestyle. As a child, I wanted nothing to do with my parents or the farm or anything. And it wasn't until really I was around 30 and had my first child, and I was living deep in suburbia, that I just felt this calling to start gardening like my godmother did and like my parents did. I just felt this tug to get back to my roots and started sort of playing around with like a one pot vegetable garden. And then that escalated to 2 raised beds, all while I was, working like a normal sort of marketing job and starting to have kids and be married and have this full life. I decided like I was so passionate about gardening and just couldn't get enough. And eventually it became my career.
So what do you think it was that sparked it, or what was it about motherhood that sparked it, do you think?
I had this vision of what I wanted for my kids. I really wanted them to have the best parts of my childhood and what I felt like gave me a lot of character and resilience. And I've always had, as an adult, sort of a reverence for nature and flowers and being outside, but I wasn't like interfacing with nature that much until I had the kids and was like, oh my gosh, I need them to be running wild and playing in the creek and, going outside, no technology. I just think I felt this sort of disdain for the modern world and modern motherhood and was like, okay, let's get back to basics. And I just knew what I had in my childhood. So even though I wasn't really that into my parents' lifestyle, they're like rodeo cowboys, like, packing mules in the backcountry, like the extreme of it. I really loved the memories I had picking wild blackberries and playing in the redwoods and running out to the creek. So I think I just wanted to recreate what I felt like was so beautiful about what I had, yet it felt really, really far away. And so I was like, I don't know, gardening just felt like I needed to get my hands dirty. And it was something the kids could do with me to pique an interest. And that really like spiraled into this whole life direction.
And would it be fair to say that you kind of honed it to kitchen gardening, that's your passion now?
Absolutely. Yeah. At first, I felt like vegetables just had the highest ROI, like the return on investment. You get to eat what you grow. It was very satisfying. And flowers felt beautiful and cool, but I was like, they're going to put them in a vase and then they'll die. And now I'm expanding more into cut flowers and fruit and all, now I'm really interested in like the shrubs around our property and things like that. But definitely kitchen gardening is, my niche, my specialty, what I love the most.
There's a line in your book, actually, and you say there's gardening and then there's kitchen gardening. And it's almost like having that productive side to it kind of gives it a whole new level of interest, maybe.
Absolutely. And I think there's a little bit of a science to it, art and science, I suppose. I'm trying to replace, the grocery store as much as I can. So I'm really thinking, how can I use my space? How can I keep these things alive? If your flowers don't bloom, that's a bummer. But if your tomato crop isn't successful, you don't get to eat tomatoes. So it feels a little bit more intense. It feels a little more intimate. I think there's a really unique satisfaction in growing your own ingredients and going out to the garden and collecting them and bringing them inside and making a meal. It's just this very 360 tactile and fulfilling experience. So I do think it's a little different, a little more intense.
So you've got a book out called Kitchen Garden Living, which obviously I've read because I can't get enough of gardening books. And it was great. And there's a lot of practical information. But I think what I really loved was the bits where you explored the philosophy, I think, behind the garden and behind what it means to you. And there was a bit I think quite near the beginning where you talk about appreciating the seasons, and it really kind of resonated with me. It seems a very simplistic concept, but actually it's something I think we quite often overlook, especially when we were doing all the jobs in the garden. But I really do feel that you encapsulated how important it is to appreciate the seasonality. And how might you do that?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for reading the book. It just means the world to me. And it's so funny. There's actually someone in the UK that I adore whose cookbook I had purchased and read, and it's Julius Roberts. He's a farmer out there, and he can really like wax poetic and get romantic about raising his animals. And I'm the same way. I love to get very like romantic and poetic about gardening and the seasons. And I was like, I can put that into the book. I think it feels good to recognize that in others, that they have the love that you have, and putting that into words, I think, to help people realize how special it is to live within the seasons and be really present. And I feel like it's a matter of kind of that saying, be where your feet are. It's like, okay, we're in winter. Let's be in the snow. Let's still go for walks. Let's go find the flora and fauna that thrive in the winter and recognize how unique that is. And instead of longing for spring or autumn or whatever your favorite season is, it's about really embracing the seasonality of what you have and cooking with the ingredients that make sense, and overwintering your veggies, and replacing tender greens with with hardy kale and chard, and just really embracing what's available to you and getting resourceful and excited about it. I think having traditions that really mark the seasons, leaning into the solstices and the equinox, it really just grounds us and gives us something to look forward to throughout the year, that just sort of reconnects us with nature and that consistency that runs through all of us.
Yeah, and I don't even think you need a particularly big garden to link your home and your garden. It's just little things, isn't it? I think.
Definitely. I've gotten to this habit. I haven't done it in a while. I'm waiting for these first snowdrops to come up, but putting like just little foraged and found like flowers or pretty greenery, clipping a few and putting them in really tiny vases by my children's beds. Like little tiny things that just give you some reverence for the outside world and just remind you of the beauty of right now.
I completely agree. And actually, off the back of reading your book, because it was December, I think, when I first saw it, I actually bought myself some tartan bedding because I thought I'm just going to really embrace the season. And I know it sounds silly, but I'm so excited for next year, like Christmas time, when I can put it on, because I'm like, it's just a
Yes.
nod to the season, isn't it? It's just celebrating it, really.
Yes. Yes, I love that. I do think, and I am like, maybe I'm so crazy, but I just think there's also a certain different type of light and smell and feeling that all comes along with the seasons. And so honoring that, I don't know, I feel like it makes me feel more alive. And maybe it's just romanticizing like what is currently going on. But like you said, having like cozy flannel tartan sheets in winter and some pine leaves that smell really good. It just, I don't know, it's like getting a hug from the season. I don't know. There's just a resonance that I think feels just so beautiful.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And the other thing that you talk about in the book, which I wanted to pick up on because I do think it's important, is that you talk about prioritizing the plants that you grow in order of how much you use them, which again sounds, if you actually take the time to stop and think and plan your garden, it makes sense. But actually, a lot of us don't do it because we're so caught up in the rush of trying to get everything done. But I think that's very key. Is that something you really focus on?
Yes, absolutely. I try to grow a mixture of things like what we eat and use the most, and then always something like really interesting or challenging that I want to try. But I definitely, sort of take inventory of like, what are we going to consume and how can I, pace it throughout the season or grow enough to replace it? And then start to fold things sort of secondary and tertiary in beyond that.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of doing it. And the other tip that you give, which I thought was a good one, was that, you find it useful to work in the garden daily, even if that's for a really short time, but you're still keeping that kind of connection going, aren't you, by doing that?
Yeah, for sure. I just recently moved from Southern California over on the West Coast to Middle Tennessee, which is like the south, even almost southeast part of America. So I'm in a totally different climate now, which makes it harder to get outside, though we have a greenhouse. But I remember hearing this saying that, what was it? Like the best thing for a garden is your shadow. And it's basically just you kind of being out there, putting eyes on things. Typically, any pest issues can be like prevented or remedied if you're just out there having eyes on things. I mean, I know crops can get just decimated overnight by deer or ground squirrels or something like that, but I've just found things are always so much more successful when I'm out there just bopping around, even for a few minutes, just getting eyes on things and it's kind of giving me that running list in my mind of what to be doing or how to be tinkering. Or sometimes you go out there and you're like, oh, the artichoke already, and you can harvest it. And I always feel like I have so much more than I'd ever realized when I'm out in the garden, just kind of snipping things to take into the house. And all of a sudden you've got a huge full basket and you're like, I didn't even realize we had things to harvest.
Again, sort of keying into the connectedness with you and the garden, do you do a lot of sort of craft activities as well that help you notice what's going on in the garden, be seasonal, be connecting the home and garden? You know, are you kind of doing that sort of thing as well?
Oh, for sure. And it was really inspired by my kids because I just really wanted them to like the garden and like nature. So it's really selfish. Like, how can I make this fun and exciting for them? But I also love to craft. I love saving and preserving flowers for pressed flowers. I talk a little bit in the book about that, making bookmarks or gift tags and ice with flowers in them. I love cooking with edible flowers, but the crafts too, it's so satisfying to get to just use everything you have and take nature and turn it into something really beautiful and really heartfelt. And I feel like other people really love that too. Whenever I've brought a hostess gift to someone and we've got some sort of a cute little craft from the garden included, it's just more meaningful because it's like your time and your love that went into it. And there are nowadays online, there are just endless, on Pinterest or something, endless ideas for crafts that you can do with like, you can make clay ornaments by pressing pine needles into it or Valentine's Day seed paper, like just all the things. There's so much. And I find it equally as satisfying to get to go out in the garden and see what's inspiring you and then just making something with it.
So actually, there's a quote from the book that I've jotted down, and you've said that there is just enoughness in the garden, which I really loved. And I felt that that sentiment filters through everything that you do in the garden. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, oh, definitely. I started noticing I'd go out again, just kind of with no real intention and come in with so much. And that's where that like contentment and joy really comes in, is letting yourself sort of be surprised. But I'd always come in with just like one handful of cherry tomatoes or like two sprigs of thyme or one cucumber. And I was able to make something that enhanced our meal, for my family of five. Just with a handful of tomatoes is enough. And it started to help me realize one, how much we think we need, but actually don't, sort of like an overconsumption thing. But the other is like just allowing enough to be enough and going out there and what you have is good enough and you can get creative about it and letting that dictate what you do and being in that enoughness is really satisfying and really going out and it's like, oh, I wanted to make something with zucchini, but that's not ripe. So we're going to pivot and make something with eggplant. And I don't know. I just think that's where you get some of that character and that resilience. And again, sort of that deep sense of joy where you're not longing for anything other than what you have and you're making the most of it. And I think it's just a beautiful feeling to really lean into that.
I don't think that we're doing anything essentially very different from previous generations, but whether you're changing the way that you work in the garden or what you use the garden for, and whether that's a generational change or whether it's a personal change, you mentioned your parents, we're not reinventing the wheel, but we are putting our own stamp on it. And another word that you write in the book is crunchy-ish, which, did make me giggle. And I don't know if people in the UK would be that familiar with that phrase, but can you explain what that means?
Yes, of course. Yeah, maybe that is a really American thing, especially a California thing, but crunchy-ish. When I was a kid, we would kind of call it granola. Like the hippies that wore Birkenstocks and lived off the land were very granola, and that led to crunchy. And that kind of just means like, sort of hippie. And now I'm totally crunchy-ish, meaning I try to always seek out like the natural medicinal plants. And like I always do these crazy, my poor kids, if they have like a fever, I'll put egg whites in their socks and I'll do that before I would ever give them Tylenol. It's just crunchy. It's it's just sort of my like earthy, gardeny, back to nature way of approaching life. Always is tinted by my crunchiness.
And is that something you might have rolled your eyes at when you were a child?
Oh my God, of course. Yes, 100%. And it's just, I was so enamored with sort of like glitz and glamour. And, to age myself, I was born in like the late 80s. So I grew up where, like in the UK, where like the Spice Girls were everything. And it's like, plastic blow up chairs and like shiny polyester jumpsuits and like sparkles and sequins. And I just wanted to be cool and like wear high heels and be fancy. And now I like want to be a hobbit and walk around barefoot and be crunchy and sip tea and grow my own ingredients for a salve. Like,
Yeah, I get it. I mean, yeah, it's amazing how your kind of perspective on things changes as you go through the decades. But well, I got the impression that you're very keen on how gardens can connect us socially, and especially today. I think that's relevant. And what's your take on that?
yeah, oh, definitely. I found from experience because where I was living, it was really unique to have a big kitchen garden and to dedicate a lot of the minimal space that we had to gardening. And it really piqued people's interests and became something I think people were so curious about and then would admit, oh, I've always kind of wanted to grow something. I've always wanted to garden. And it just felt like a really cool and unique way to connect with friends, neighbors, anybody. Once it's mentioned that I love gardening, people come out of the woodwork and, want to chat about it. And I feel like it's this very beautiful spark that you recognize or bring alive in someone when you mention that you like gardening. I know culturally, I feel like, in the UK, it's much more common to garden. But in the States here, it's not a given. Not everyone grows up with a little garden. I don't think people really seek out growing their own food or flowers. It's not a given that you would do that. So I really love how interesting and exciting and sort of novel it can be to people and inviting them in and sort of trying to inspire and influence them to just take a little piece of it, grow some herbs, maybe just try it. I just love to sort of indoctrinate people.
Yeah, and you also, I think, gift your gluts sometimes to get people on board. Does that work in sparking an interest?
Oh, absolutely. I remember when I first started gardening and became like completely obsessed, my husband was like, we lived in a townhouse and had no yard, like none whatsoever. But in the front where we parked our car, like next to our car was this patch of dead lawn. And we convinced our homeowners association to let us build two raised beds because I promised I would water with my own water, like from our house. So I drug this 50-foot hose through my townhouse to water because there's a huge drought in California. So we couldn't use water to water the lawns outside. So I convinced them to let me start this garden. And I was like, if you guys let me garden and use my own water and pay for the entire project, I will also share everything I grow with the neighbors. And it was incredible. We got to know everyone really, really well. And so many people were like, they had never tasted homegrown tomatoes. They didn't know what basil was. They had never experienced any of these things. And it was really cool to introduce people to that flavor gap and that increase in taste and nutrition and just show them the beauty of gardening. And my kids would deliver the veggies to the neighbors. So we're always trying to gift people things from the garden because it's just the best. I've yet to meet someone who's not totally dazzled by getting something that you grew from the garden.
It's such a personal gift and it means such a lot. I don't know why really, but I really feel that it does when someone gives you something that they've kind of nurtured themselves. It's a very valuable gift. And to take that a little bit further, not just your neighbours, you're inspiring people on a wider level. So can you tell me about the Kitchen Garden Society?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Sort of again, back when I was first starting out, I realized that my garden was different than most of the gardens written about in books that are in sort of the Midwest part of the country. And my seasons were sort of flip-flopped. And so I realized that across the country, everyone's gardening, but we have a little bit of a different timeline, different things that we can grow, different ways to make your garden successful based on your climate. So I started this membership called the Kitchen Garden Society. And every month I post what you can do in your US hardiness zone and then some timely lessons. So right now would be like companion planting and indoor seed starting and how to plan the kitchen garden. And we talk about dividing your perennials and just little lessons throughout the month and sort of what to do so you can be gardening year round. Yeah, it was just kind of my way of creating something that would help everyone stay on track without constantly having to Google like what to do in my garden in February.
Yeah, that's very valuable. So what's next for you? What's your next challenge in the gardening world?
Well, it will definitely be getting more accustomed to more traditional seasons. And, we have a true winter here. We have snow on the ground right now. It freezes, there's frost. So truly figuring out how to grow things in early spring. That wasn't really, I know it sounds so silly, but we never grew any brassicas until the fall. So early spring planting of like broccoli and cauliflower and whatnot is unusual for me. So it's really going to be a big learning curve of gardening a little more traditionally and seeing that I can get everything I need, in maybe the 8 or 9 months that we get to have, which is still a very long season. I'm learning the greenhouse, which is interesting, and figuring out, like ventilation and fans on my seedlings and all those things and seeing what pests we're going to have here. It's going to be a journey. In Southern California, you can grow year round, absolutely no frost whatsoever. So you can actually be sort of a bad gardener because if something fails, you're like, "Ooh, I'll just throw in a new seedling. It's fine." That is not going to be the case here. So I'm really going to have to prove my groove over here.
Thank you to Bailey for her thoughtful and connected take on productive gardening. And thanks to you as well for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 171, Grow Easy with Anna Greenland, and 181, Huw Richards on veg growing. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.